Hi everyone, it's Jen here and welcome to Jen's World About Art. So for today's painting I am doing a cityscape and it's of the city of Melbourne, which is a beautiful city here in Australia. So I'm going to start by adding a wash over the background and I'm covering the buildings as well. I just add pure water to begin with and then I drop in ultramarine blue for the sky just to help to create a skyline. And I actually I go over all the buildings because all the buildings, the reflections in the windows is going, and on the sides of the buildings will be reflecting the sky because a lot of the buildings are glass. So I continue down and create that sky. I actually take it down towards the water as well on the right hand side, and for the water I go in with pure ultramarine blue and I add it starting with a pale wash and I build up from light to dark. Now I'm going to start painting the bridge and I go in with pure yellow ochre, very diluted, so add lots of water and just a touch of yellow ochre, and I take that across the whole side of the bridge. And underneath it's got a blue stone sort of structure, so I make up a blue grey with burnt umber cobalt blue. It makes a lovely natural sort of a blue grey colour. And then I'm going to add, the bridge is held together with metal ribbings from the looks of it, so I'm just painting in the metal ribbings and I'll pop in some of the patterns that are on the tops of the bridges as well. And I used a bit of burnt sienna for that reddish colour, because it creates a lovely sort of rusty colour. It's just really, it worked well. So this part of the bridge that I just added the greyish colour is bluestone, so I'm adding a bit more texture to that, a little bit more of a darker grey, still using the burnt umber cobalt blue. So I'm starting to work on the buildings now, and I take a brown colour, like I use a bit of burnt umber and I add a little touch of blue to it and I dilute it right down for those left side buildings, and I just put a wet wash over the top of those. For the chapel on the right I've used a bit of burnt umber and a little touch of burnt sienna, and then because they're made up of a different kind of stone. And now for the glass buildings I use ultramarine blue, and I've made that quite a strong colour. Afterwards I will add a glaze over the top, and by glaze I mean I'm going to go over all of the buildings again just with a purpley tone, just to dull all the detail down, because there's a bit too much detail going on. It sort of draws the eye. So after I've added all the detail I'm going to dull it down with a glaze over the top. So I go in with a few different greys and a few different blues just to create the buildings. And you'll see the shadow sides, the darker sides. Most of the buildings on the one side are darker because of the way the light's hitting them. So yeah, I darken up the left hand side of pretty much all of the buildings, and because that's the shadow area. Now I'm starting to add window detail, and I just come down this big building in the front centre again, and I also go in, you can see I'm using varying tones of blue greys, and I go into that other tall tower and just start to fill in. And as you can see the left side is slightly darker than the right on each of the buildings. And now I start to add in the little window details, and that is literally just little lines, little tiny lines in the directions of the shape of the building. And I'm actually using the same sort of coloured paint, just slightly darker tones on each of the buildings for the windows. So on the greyish buildings I'm using a browny grey tone for the windows. On the blue buildings I'm using a blue tone for the glass, for the windows. So yeah, you can see that on the browner buildings I've used a brown tone, on the bluer buildings I use a blue tone for the windows. Now I'm going over the whole background of the lower area below the buildings, which is like a walking area. There's all restaurants and park and places to walk down there, because I've been and had lunch there quite a few times. So I start to add browner details. I add the shadows under the bridge using a dark purpley grey colour, and I start to build up those details as well. Now for the green I've used sap green with a touch of indigo just to darken it up, because our trees here are quite dark on the tops of the trees down on the waterfront there. So I've added a dark green made up of indigo and sap green, and then I go over the rest of the background with a wash of a purpley grey in the shadow areas, and I will build that up darker as I go. And I go to that same green and I bring that onto the trees on the right hand side there, just in the foreground. and I add, there'll be 2 or 3 layers, so they get darker at they've got a little bit of light hitting them at the top, so I'd go lighter to the top and darker to the bottom. And I've popped in a couple of palm trees. There is a few palm trees along there. So now I start to darken up the water, and I go in with a pure ultramarine, and I've added a little bit of brown to it as well because the water is a little bit murky, so there is a little bit of a brown tint to the water. I leave little gaps for the highlights on the waves as well. And now I start to work on the canoe in there with 4 or 5 people in it. So I'm leaving those as the white of the paper. And so I'm just painting around them, going up darker each layer. So starting at the back and working my way forward, I start darker and then I pop the reflection in for the bridge there. And anywhere that I can see is darker, I will add stronger pigment each layer. So deeper, darker ultramarine blue, just less water, more paint, and I've cut around the canoers there. So there's 5 people in that canoe. I add, in the lighter area, I don't go over all of it. I leave where the wake from the boat is, it's a bit lighter, so I've left that lighter paper. And then I sort of add some down on the bottom right. So that's ultramarine blue, and I've added a little touch of brown to that. So now I start to build up the shadows in the background. There's a few sort of buildings that you can't really see the detail of back there, so I just pop them in as a purple grey colour, and I decide that colour would make a good shadow colour for under the bridge. So I also take that colour under the bridge into between the gaps of where the rusty ribs are. And now I decide to add some brick texture underneath the bridge because the bridge is held up by bluestone blocks. So I pop those textures in, but as I said before, I will add a wash over the top of a very diluted purpley tone just to even all that out so there's not so much going on in the painting. So now I start to add an even stronger layer, so a lot more pigment, a lot less water to the water area on the painting. And then I go back up onto the painting itself and start to add more detail onto the buildings. And anywhere I can see that needs a little bit more work. And I'm using the same colours, so I'm using that purpley tone. And now I'm just adding the texture of all the windows. And just being sure to follow the shape of the building. I pop the shadow on the cathedral. I darken up that left face of these buildings, the 2 glass buildings to the right. Then I start to pop in their windows. And again, it's just little stripes in the directions of the buildings just to create that effect of windows. So now I add a glaze under the bridge just to dull down those bluestone bricks, and I use a purpley tone. For the trees, I go in and add a few more layers of darker greens, still using a sap green with a touch of indigo. I add pyrrole red to the little people sitting in the canoe just so that they stand out a little bit, and I add some shadows around the canoe just to give it a bit more definition. And now I'm starting to pop a glaze over all the buildings. So it's just a very pale purple tone. And I take that across all the buildings just to dull them down a little bit so that all the dots don't stand out too much. So now I'm going to add shadow tones under the trees. So I make a very, very dark green into the shadow areas under all of the trees. So I've used sap green, but a lot more indigo and less water, more pigment, so it's stronger. It makes a stronger colour. And I'm also doing the trees up to the top left hand side there, popping a bit of detail in and around. And we are done. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd love it if you click like and subscribe. Click on the bell icon, that way you'll be notified when I release a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and have an awesome day. Okie doke. Bye.